Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session, Seeking Wellbeing in a Distressed World. I'm pleased to be your moderator. My name is Sarah Hillware, and thank you all for joining us today. We're really looking forward to a wonderful and engaging session. Distinguished speakers, organizers, and guests, it's an honor to be with you. And sincere thanks to the C20 Secretariat for having me, and congratulations on an historic C20 communique, guided by principles of collaboration, transparency, inclusivity, gender equality, and human rights. To frame our discussion, I'd like to make 4 key points on well-being during this pandemic and beyond. 1, last first. 2, pay unpaid women. 3, gender equality is for all. 4, work across boundaries. My first point, put the last first. To achieve well-being, we must put the most marginalized at the center of all policies, programs, and most importantly, budgets, because this benefits everyone. This means making space for girls and women to lead on designing solutions at all levels, especially those from low and middle income countries and underrepresented groups, and standing firm to protect education and life-saving SRHR services during emergencies. Investing in health and education also staves off another global crisis, the climate crisis. Climate change affects the vulnerable the most. A recent journal article estimates that a 1 unit increase in fine particle concentration is associated with a 9% increase in COVID-19 related mortality. And globally, those from underrepresented groups are more likely to live with 66% more air pollution. 2, pay unpaid women. We must stop allowing systems across all sectors, especially health, to be subsidized by the poorest women and girls. In particular, women health workers contribute an estimated $3 trillion to our gross world product, of which nearly half is unpaid. More broadly, women and girls perform over 75% of all household and unpaid care work. It's absolutely critical to bring both women's unpaid work in health and social care into the formal labor market where appropriate, and work to change norms to redistribute unpaid household and family care equally between men and women. 3, gender equality is for all. We must prioritize gender equality and recognize that it's everyone's business. A more equal world benefits everyone. In the case of COVID-19, men have worse health outcomes, higher mortality from COVID-19 in almost all countries. And it's been noted that women political leaders are doing far better than their male counterparts in responding to this pandemic. Yet, it's not because women are born with an empathetic gene or with bigger ears that make them better listeners. Evidence shows that many female leaders practice a style of leadership that's less individualistic, more inclusive, and more effective in building public trust. Everyone can do this, men included. 4, work across boundaries. We cannot achieve the SDGs in silos. We must work across sectors and borders to achieve meaningful progress. As mentioned in the communique, all G20 countries must come together by allocating 1% of domestic fiscal stimulus spending to the global response. We must also utilize global coordination bodies and mechanisms to build back better post-COVID-19, including NGOs, governments, both LMIC and high income, foundations, private sector activists, and academics. This will require a whole of society approach from the community level, with women's movements for health, climate, and social justice leading the way and putting pressure on their domestic leaders. As Deputy Director of Women in Global Health, a global movement to challenge power and privilege for gender equity in health, and Board Chair of Girls Health Ed, an NGO enabling adolescent girls to change culture and gender norms through health and sexuality education, I've had the unique privilege of seeing the power and resilience of civil society to bring about change, and most notably, I've seen glimpses of what the world could look like if we would only turn the key to unlock our secret weapon, girls and women. While the word gender is not in the title of today's discussion, we must never stop reminding G20 leaders that gender equality is and should be considered part of every issue concerning people and the planet. But as long as it remains a siloed issue and put on the back burner during emergencies, we'll never achieve the SDGs. With that, I'd like to hand the floor over to our first speaker, Ambassador Michelle Bocuse, the Director General's Envoy for Multilateral Affairs at the World Health Organization. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be sharing a few thoughts with you. I think it's a very, very important meeting. And thank you very much for the introduction you gave. I think that covered very, very important topic that we don't have to, we have to keep in mind very much. So the theme of our discussion today is around well-being. So what is well-being? I would like to come back to a very old text, the Constitution of the World Health Organization, that was written in 1948, 75 years ago. 72 years ago, sorry. So what is it? What does it say? It says health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. The enjoyment of the highest attainable standards of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, without distinctions. The health of all people is fundamental to the attainment of peace and security, and dependent upon the full cooperation of individual and states. So, as you see already at this time, there was this framing of health and well-being together as being key, absolutely key elements for our planet, for the people, and for our development.
Thank you for that excellent introduction and for framing what well-being means. We are really delighted to have you here with us. And my first question to you, in what ways has COVID-19 contributed to the disruption of essential health services, especially vaccine campaigns targeting children and vulnerable populations?
Well, COVID has created many disruptions to essential health services because of lockdowns, travel restriction, lockdown measures, and many others. This has affected every and all the levels of the population, but has disproportionately addressed the most vulnerable segments of the population. What the way children, refugees, migrants, vulnerable populations have been affected is huge. There's been an alarming decline in the number of children receiving life-saving vaccines around the world. It's the first time in 28 years that the world could see a reduction in DTP3 coverage, which is the marker of immunization. We have seen also more than 30 measles vaccinations campaigns that have been cancelled across the world, and thus creating a risk for further outbreak. The pandemic has really intensified the vulnerabilities and inadequacies of the global food system, and an additional 80 to 130 million people may go hungry this year as a result of economic recession. And by the way, I would like to congratulate the World Food Programme on their Nobel Peace Prize today, and that shows that the world really cares about that dimension, and that has been one of the major disruptions around the world with the health disruptions. Of course, you mentioned SRHR, and those services have been disrupted or given up in many countries. There are also, in the context of HIV, more than 70 countries that experience stockout of antiretroviral medicine, and we see that, according to our models, a 6-month disruption in access to antiretrovirals could lead to a doubling of AIDS-related deaths in sub-Saharan Africa in 2020 alone. There have been severe disruption to life-saving interventions in relation to TB, malaria, and of course the maternal and childhood services, the screening, the diagnostic, the treatment and services for non-communicable diseases. So we need indeed to now think of building back better, building back healthier, greener, more inclusive, and taking into account those essential services and strengthening health systems is absolutely key if we want to build back better. Making sure that everywhere around the world, everybody can access essential services without incurring financial hardship. And that affects particularly women, particularly children, and vulnerable populations.
Thank you, Ambassador. My next question for you is, can you tell us more about the Access to COVID-19 Tools ACT Accelerator and how it will accelerate the development and equitable access of medical technologies, therapeutics, and diagnostics? And also, how can women's leadership play a role in equitable access?
ACT Accelerator has been launched by our Director General, Dr. Tedros, with a number of leaders around the world on the 24th of April. The purpose is really to accelerate the research and, above all, the development and the equitable distribution of new tools in terms of vaccines, therapeutics, diagnostics. And also what we call the health systems connectors, which is a sort of horizontal pillar that will allow those products, when they're available, to be distributed around the world. So why ACT Accelerator is so important? There would be, of course, development and manufacturing of vaccines, but what we want to make sure is that they're equitably accessible to everybody. For example, if the rich country buy up the first 2 billion doses of vaccines, instead of making sure they are distributed in proportion to the global population, then almost twice as many people could die from COVID-19. We also look at what is being bought at the moment in terms of vaccines. So at the moment, if we look at the numbers, high-income countries have reserved enough vaccine doses for over 250% of their own population, while low and lower middle income countries would only be able to vaccinate 14% of their populations. So what should we do? Dr. Tedros, our Director General, says you should not vaccinate all people in some countries, but we should vaccinate some people in all countries. So we defined an allocation list, a priority allocation list, and we know that these are the health workers, of course, the frontliners, the ones that are really in constant contact around the world, and also the most vulnerable populations, the people with comorbidities and the people in the most vulnerable settings that are disproportionately affected. If we use those doses to vaccinate these people, we really make a difference at global level, and we really protect the world and protect the most vulnerable in particular. So what about women in that role, and what about women leadership? I think you told us very nicely what a difference it makes in terms of leadership, and how women leaders have really been playing a key role and have obtained very good results in their countries, because they play collectively and they do not play in an individual manner. I think that's a message. I think we have to work collectively, and women, if they carry this message of collective empowerment, is very important. Allow me to remind you that 70% of the health workforce is composed of women, but there's the glass ceiling as usual, and they're mostly the frontliners and not necessarily always in the decision-making groups. We have a few strong women that are really playing a key role in ACT Accelerator, and I would like to quote one, but there are many behind them. But I would like to quote Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, who is the former Minister of Finance of Nigeria, the chair of Gavi Board, candidate for DG to WTO, and she's a special envoy for WTO ACT Accelerator. She's a woman who's giving the vision. She's one of those women who's saying, what are we doing that for? Who do we want to protect? What do we want to protect the world from? And how can we play collective game all together?
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And what a great quote. It's really great to hear all of the work of the World Health Organization and partners globally. Our next speaker is Mr. Haoling Zhu, and he's the Assistant Secretary General and Director of Bureau for Policy and Program Support at the UN Development Program. Mr. Zhu, I'm turning the floor over to you for a brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. So I'm very happy to join this meeting to stand in for UNDP Administrator Akin Steiner, who unfortunately cannot join due to last-minute commitment. And in my introductory remarks, I was asked to lay out, what we think, is the definition of well-being. So, and this is a question that we think all the time, every day, I must say. And let me go back to what UNDP has been focusing on over the last 30 years, the question of human development. A Human Development Index that started 30 years ago. And that started with the concept that were advanced by Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq, right? The question of definition of well-being, essentially, that goes beyond the income, and wealth, right, and GDP, right? And since 1990, 30 years ago, we have tried to practice this concept of well-being through the promotion of Human Development Index, right? The concept of human development, as I said, inspired by Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq. So I think in Amartya Sen's writing, okay, he argues that the proper focus, for understanding well-being is really on what people can be and can do, right, rather than simply on what they have, right? So this capabilities approach, engages with both the objective and the subjective perceptions of well-being, right? And in also his writing, he emphasizes the freedom, okay, right? Development, as freedom. That's how he defines it. And the freedom is an approach that distinguishes between people's capabilities and what they do with these capabilities, right? So he emphasizes the capabilities quite importantly and the freedom of choice, in their use of these capabilities. So the pursuit of fairness, okay, in his writing, right, that is the societal aspirations towards capability, dignity, rights, and so forth, right? And this new capabilities for all, at all stages of every individual's life is really, a narrative, of what well-being is about, right? So this is going back to the starting point, the Nobel winning, Nobel Prize winning, academics, what he has advised, So we have really tried to understand this and follow and practice this. But in reality, over the last 30 years, the measurement of well-being, has gone beyond the GDP. It has not changed fundamentally how we measure development, but this has changed. On a matrix to measure well-being, for example, right? We now have many multidimensional poverty indexes, right? There's no international definition, but many countries, have followed the principles of going beyond income, right? Looking at deprivation, looking at opportunities to measure success, right? And measure, well-being of individuals. The Human Development Index is one, but also it has evolved because you have now inequality and gender-adjusted human development indexes, right? That measures well-being of individuals, right? And also in terms of policy and programmatic, frameworks, we have this, SDG agenda, right? That is that definitely, goes beyond the income, right? And it is a multi-sectoral integrated approach, to look at development, and has combinations of programs and interventions, right? And many interconnected approach to deal with both, social, economic, as well as environment, sustainability. So the well-being, also goes beyond now. The one new complexity that we have now in defining well-being is the uncertainty and the complexity that we're facing because of these multiple dimensions of issues that we need to consider, not only for human beings but also for the planet. Right? So this uncertainty, is forcing us to adapt, right? To redefine and to understand better and redefine, how we look at the question of well-being. And so I think what we're saying now is that the question of well-being, the definition needs to, marry what the Amartya Sen and Mahbub ul Haq has been advocating, the human side of this well-being, with the writings of other scholars, okay, that have been advocating, such as the Nicholas Stern, right, who has written a lot about climate, and who is an economist at London School of Economics, but also like Nobel laureate, William Nordhaus, from Nordhaus, right, from Yale University, who won Nobel Prize for his work, on climate and economics. But also people like I think Kate Raworth, right, from Cambridge, who has written about so-called donut economy, arguing that the well-being, right, and the development must be defined by both the societal, boundaries as well as planetary boundaries. So we think, these two schools of, writing or thoughts, one on, centers on human beings, one also, brings in the planetary, health, should marry, and then that really, should define how we look at well-being. And as I said, I go back to the question of SDGs, right? Because SDGs is the framework that goes beyond, this, a single sector issues. It's interconnected, right? And it involves climate change, right? And if we marry the SDG agenda, climate agenda, and about the super year for diversity, this year, and I think, we have, a good definition of this well-being. And
Wonderful.
I think for UNDP, yeah, we look
Thank
at
you, Mr. Zhu.
inequality also quite significantly. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Really appreciate that, and also the the point about combining the SDG agenda to ensure that we're focusing on a whole of society and a multi-sectoral approach. I have one question for you, and that is, which reform commitments are needed from the international community and G20, and how can they react specifically to threats to the well-being of the planet and the most vulnerable in society?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think the most important commitment we need from the international community, including the G20, is the affirmation to the multilateralism and multilateral cooperation. As the world is faced with significant challenges of development, sustainable development, but compounded by the COVID-19 crisis. And this commitment to multilateralism is ever more important, right? But fortunately, there are a lot of hopes, that we see, that are being practiced. I think the Nobel Prize, award to WFP today is an affirmation to multilateral action, right? And the WHO, colleague has just spoke. I think the COVAX, initiative, right, that is covering 168 countries today, right, supporting non-vaccine, the kind of initiative that we want to see. And for G20 specifically, we know that there are structural challenges in terms of indebtedness of developing countries, not only the least developed countries and low-income countries, but also middle-income countries, right? So we think that we should all urge, G20 members to extend the debt relief, the debt still, initiative, right, to all countries that need it, for example, right? And we have to really work very hard, to address, how capital, right, is utilized, not only to pursue economic means, but really to pursue societal well-being. Right? And there are more initiatives that I can speak to, right? For the IMF, for example, right, there are calls for new, special joint rights allocations, right, to deal with the kind of fiscal challenges that many developing countries are facing in dealing with both a development crisis as well as a health crisis, which is turning into a humanitarian crisis, we know, right? So, so there are many initiatives we can speak to, but I think the key issue is really a commitment to multilateralism.
Great, thank you very much. I'd like to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Ramina Barini. So Dr. Ramina, I'm handing the floor over to you to present your introduction and perspective on the definition of well-being. Thank you.
I'm so happy to be with you, Sarah. Thank you so much. And thanks to the C20 and the C20 community for bringing us together around the questions of well-being, which is a central question in my organization, the OECD, whose mission is better policies for better life. But the well-being question is also actually the central issue we're looking at in the Center for Well-being, Inclusion, Sustainability and Equal Opportunity, the WISE Center that we just created at the OECD. And in fact, this is a really, really recent center we created last summer. And we did that at this point in time because we wanted to make sure that we would recognize the importance of the well-being agenda to address the challenges of our economies as societies just now in the aftermath of the COVID crisis. But in fact, the OECD has been working on the notion of well-being and on the framework of well-being over the last 50 years, I would say, but it's really over the last 15 years that we accelerated very much our efforts. And the way we define well-being is relatively simple. We really start from the prism of what matters to people. So we really look at the range of outcomes that are important for people to be well, do well, and thrive. And so within that, actually, we also, in fact, being inspired by the work of Amartya Sen that the previous speaker reminded us. And so it's in our framework, we also giving a lot of attention to the notion of capabilities and freedom of choice, and to the agency, but also to the notion of the sense of purpose and meaning that people may have. The other accent we are putting in our well-being framework is the importance to consider the distribution of outcomes, the principles of equity, recognition, and social justice, but also the resources that drive well-being over time. And some of the previous speakers already mentioned that of course, the well-being and the SDGs agenda are just indivisible ones and are really, really closely related. So the reasons why we're looking at sustainability, of course, is because this is speaking of the future well-being. So if we don't look at resources that generate well-being today, we have no way to make sure that the well-being of future generations is going to be maintained. Now, you may wonder why the OECD decided to create the center now, and the reason is very simple, because we actually think that the well-being approaches and the well-being lens are just necessary to save us now and to save the planet now. And I think the pandemic has been a very, very powerful and dramatic reminder about the fragility of our human systems. Some of other previous speakers, in fact, already highlighted one of the points I think that we stress very much in the research and in the evidence that we produced in the last 6 months at the OECD, the fact that essentially the pandemic has highlighted and increased a lot vulnerabilities and inequalities at a point in time where inequalities were already very high in the OECD. In fact, we made some interesting study around economic vulnerability, and that study was done just before the pandemic hit. And that study showed that essentially 1 in 3 people would have a chance to fall poor, to become poor, if they had to forego 3 months of income. And then the pandemic happened, and then many countries locked down their economies. So there you go. You have, countries essentially and people, especially the most fragile households, that forego 3 months of income, if not more. Of course, the immensity of the pandemics on people's lives is not just about, to what extent this is increasing economic stress, although this is important not just to understand, let's say, the consequences of the crisis on people's life today, but when you look at economic stress, you actually also get a sense of how this is going to be passed on future generations, because it's especially true that the most affected households, those with children, are the ones that are going to have real issues and really will struggle to ensure that they will exit from the critical situation where they are today, and the children of the most vulnerable will suffer. So that's really the opportunities that will be framed, right now. But it's not, as I said, about economic well-being. This is really about understanding the other dimensions of people well-being, and health is, of course, of primary importance. I wanted to, in fact, say a word around mental health. So obviously, the most immediate evidence we have in terms of COVID is the number of people that have died out of that. But also in terms of mental health, we saw that the outcomes have been tremendously detrimental and tremendously negative. And in fact, in all OECD countries for which we have data, we can observe that there was a rise in depression, anxiety, and a feeling of loneliness. So really, this is another, I think, very, very clear signal that the pandemic is changing, the lives of people in a way, again, that exposes vulnerabilities. So I think I'll stop it here, perhaps for this introduction, just to say that now is the time to act for our governments and policies and make sure that they put the well-being perspective at the very center. This is why at the OECD, we are strongly calling for action around recovery and resetting and reconstruction that are really fully inclusive and resilient.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barini. And I'm really glad that you brought up the point about mental health. My next question for you is, how are current policies and frameworks across sectors and countries threatening well-being? And how are they disproportionately affecting marginalized groups in society?
So, of course, when you look at well-being of people, it's not just about the aspects that depend from the economic conditions, but it's also a lot about the relational aspects or other non-market factors. And sometimes those, in fact, non-market factors and those relational aspects can actually be affected by policies, even if I would say in unintended way. But it's not just, of course, the role of policies. The policies have, I would say, primarily sort of influence on people's well-being. This is what we're focusing on at the OECD, try to understand, what should be the policy priorities to enhance people's well-being. But maybe I would highlight a couple of points, specific points in that respect. First of all, indeed, the idea that when you take a well-being perspective, you are going holistic and you're looking at essentially the notion of well-being from a very systemic point of view, which means you need to take the integration of the policies, measures, and strategies. And so, for instance, you can't just look at the issues of how the well-being of workers is in, the agricultural sector, if at the same time you're not looking at other conditions that are affecting, without beyond, let's say, the conditions and the factors and matters for agriculture in particular. So in general, a very important point to stress is this idea that we need to go whole of the government. So it means we really need to join up policies. We want to make sure that investments are being made in a way that is synergistic. And very importantly, the fact that we do want to take into account distributional consideration. So if you look at the way a lot of policies are being designed still today, you actually see that they are done, in very aggregate terms. They are not tailored, they're not bespoke to very specific conditions of people and citizens. So this idea that we need to look at the distributional impacts, it's quite fundamental. And so, for trade policies, for agricultural policies, even for educational policies, social policies, all of those really need to be specifically done and implemented with a view of maximizing the opportunities of people of the most vulnerable population. And the final point I wanted to make very quickly is the role of the business sector and other actors in the society, because of course, it's not just the governments that plays a big role. The government can do a lot to catalyze good actions and responsible actions from the business sector. They can provide a lot of incentives to make sure that companies and the markets are also operating in the right direction.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Barini. And my last question to you, if I could just briefly ask you, is about inclusive growth. So how can complexities and challenges to achieving well-being, especially inclusive growth, be addressed? Thank you.
So that's a place where actually we did quite a lot of work at the OECD. So actually getting it concrete, because indeed, when you start working on well-being, there is quite a lot of complexity. You really have to address a lot of questions and look at different groups in the society, different policies. But actually, it's relatively simple. It's about defining the policy success in terms of the inputs on people's well-being. And actually, it means three very specific things. First of all, to develop indicators to monitor success and to evaluate policy. Second, I already mentioned this idea that you need to go whole of the governments, improve alignment across the boards, across the boundaries. I think you used that expression, Sarah, when you started. And this idea that we want to make sure that the different parts of governments are obviously working together. Finally, one that is critically important for the civil society that is listening to us today is the idea that all the policies need to be co-constructed and actually shaped with the stakeholders and with the citizens. And in fact, there are many, many ways to do so, and very interesting approach that have been developed in many countries. So this is possible, and it's just about sharing knowledge about what works better.
Yes, thank you very much. And that's such a critical point about shaping policies with stakeholders, and really involving them upfront. Thank you so much for that. Next, I'd like to go to Dr. Rupa Dutt, Executive Director of Women in Global Health. And Dr. Dutt, I will turn to you to introduce yourself and give your perspective and definition on well-being. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. And it is really a pleasure to be with all of you esteemed panelists today and be part of this discussion really around civil society engagement. So a little bit background is that I am the Executive Director of Women in Global Health, and we are the largest global movement bringing together women and allies to challenge power and privilege for gender equity in health. We have nearly 25 chapters on all continents around the world, bringing together almost 35,000 supporters, really mobilizing for the issue of gender equality and health, and both critical aspects of social and health and well-being. And so, the definition that Ambassador Bacos opened with, the one from World Health Organization, is really a fundamental one, really recognizing that well-being is not only being healthy, but it is also from a mental and psychosocial aspect, being, really feeling supported, safe, happy, comfortable. So really using this human dimensions aspect. And critical to that is that we really make sure that all citizens, all people in the world really feel enabled. And so for us to really have a well-being, we need all genders, including women, especially women and girls, to really be, supported and enabled so that they can reach their maximum potential in their livelihoods.
So much, Dr. Dutt. That's excellent. And my first question for you is, how can having more women at the decision-making table in global health help us achieve greater well-being? Why does it matter?
Yeah, so excellent question, Sarah. And it's, you opened it in your key messages there that, one, we really need to recognize that women are a talent pool. And when we don't use women's expertise, we're missing out on the best solutions. And we're going to continue to, fail at what we're doing. Prime example is really taking a look at, the pandemic right now. Women are experts in health systems. However, they're being excluded from decision-making at all levels, and that weakens our health systems. So some key data points are women make up 70% of the health workforce, but represent only 25% of senior leadership roles in global health. If you take that a step further and contextualize it into COVID-19, we just did a recent review published in the BMJ, British Medical Journal, showing that when you take a look at 115 COVID-19 decision-making advisory bodies that are comprised of over 87 countries around the world, 85% of those decision-making bodies are majority men, and less than 5% of them actually have gender parity. So we know that even at the national level, when it is an appointment process, there's so much gender bias, and women make up almost 70% of the response, but in many settings, they're about 90% of the frontline response, and we're not tapping into that expertise. We also know from research done more broadly that diverse perspectives in leadership strengthens health systems and save lives. Female decision makers are change agents, and they really change the agenda so it is much more inclusive. And it's not only focusing on the disease lens, but truly on the health and well-being. Research has also shown that when you do have diverse teams, there's a dividend return. We know there is a gender dividend. So women are more enabled and empowered. There is an increase in education and training opportunities. We also know that there's a health dividend, particularly when gender balance teams happen. They're more likely to have gender responsive agendas and have the female perspective in shaping and the solutions that are being designed. We also know that this creates safer work conditions and work conditions that acknowledge that health systems should not only be designed by men for men, but really be designed by all genders for all genders. And particularly women making up majority of the workforce, health systems being gender blind actually weakens the health system. And then there's also the development dividend. And, again, echoing a lot of the colleagues before that have said that we know financial and social protection is increased when women are part of the decision-making process as well. And, all of these things also lead to, when you have diverse teams, we know there's an innovation dividend, a knowledge dividend, and there's much more effective and ethical responses. So it's not only the right thing to do, the smart thing to do, but it also leads to a multiplier effect. And so having women at the decision-making role is critical for health and well-being. And finally, I'd like to really say is that we cannot win this fight against the pandemic or normal health challenges using half of the global talent pool. So the voices and experiences and perspectives of women, especially women from diverse backgrounds, from low resource settings, global south, they really must be included for us to achieve truly this well-being that we envision collectively.
Thank you so much, Dr. Dot. And it's absolutely right that we need to ensure that we're utilizing all of our talent pool, and we all miss out when we don't do that. Thank you. My next question for you is, why does it matter to health and economic well-being that half of the work that women workers, health workers do globally is actually unpaid?
Yeah, so Sarah, exactly, you opened with the remark, the key point right there is that when you look at women in the health workforce, they're providing healthcare to 5 billion of the world's population. 50% of what they do in the health sector is unpaid work, informal, which amounts to about $1.3 trillion, and that's considered to be annually estimate. So if we actually factor in women's unpaid work that they're doing in their household, in their communities, we're seeing that go up exponentially in COVID-19. On average, it's 2 to 3 hours of more household responsibilities. But with COVID-19, we know there's with homeschooling, taking care of elderly family members, taking care of the community, and much more primary care actually happening inside a home, inside a household. We know that the workload is increasing, but all of these women are also, as a result of being in the informal sector and not being compensated for the unpaid household work that they're also doing, means that they are more economically vulnerable. And, as we've heard from other speakers, that when we look at health and well-being, we can't separate the economic dimensions. We cannot separate the financial protections, the social protections that every woman really deserves to have. And so when women are still in this informal sector, it not only impacts them individually, it also impacts the health system. So particularly women are the social shock absorbers. They carry the burden of unpaid work, and this expands in emergencies. But we know that we are setting up health systems in a way where it is a house of cards that can come tumbling down at any point in time because of the mere fact that it is the poorest women that are subsidizing the healthcare, and they are already the shock absorbers, and any little bit, tips over the entire health workforce and social workforce, so that we really do not have systems that can provide the care that we need. We also know that when we take a look at unpaid work, we need to start seeing this as not a woman's issue only, but really gender equality benefits everyone. And some of the work that's come out, especially from the World Bank, has given estimates that if we truly had gender equal societies and gender equal from political decision-making, education, economic participation, so closing the gender pay gap, education, all the different aspects, that we would have almost $160 trillion gain in human capital. And we're missing out in that when we are operating in gender unequal societies. And so that really affects everyone. It is as much the business of men as it is the business of women to advocate for this. So really, gender equity is about strengthening health systems, but also strengthening societies more widely. And that is why we must really ensure that instead of applauding health workers, we really, and sort of taking this applause, we must really turn it into real action, real investments for safe and decent health worker conditions, but also paid and formal jobs, so we continue to, again, have much more sustainable and resilient health systems.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Dot. Excellent points. And now I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Tennyson Williams. Mr. Tennyson Williams is the Director for Africa at the World Animal Protection. Mr. Williams, I'm handing the floor to you to do a brief introduction and present your definition and perspective of well-being. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you to the C20 organizers for offering us this opportunity to be on this great platform. Many have said what they've said concerning the definition of well-being, but from our perspective, being an animal welfare organization, we would like to offer our views as follows: that well-being is in fact the state of being comfortable or healthy or happy, and the fact that past experiences, attitudes, and outlook can all impact well-being, as can be physical or emotional trauma following from specific incidents. So our contribution to this discussion is really looking at animal welfare from the COVID-19 pandemic perspective. So the COVID-19 pandemic has had global ramifications upon the human population in terms of human health and livelihoods, and thus disrupted the well-being of millions of people. It is important to highlight that the global wildlife trade is believed to be the root cause of this pandemic, because through it, wild animals and wild animal products carry pathogens far and wide, often affecting people with no previous exposure to the pathogens. It has been reported that more than 70% of zoonotic diseases have come from wildlife. Animals exposed to stress and cruelty are more susceptible to infections, and therefore they shed more pathogens into the environment from where human beings may pick them. In order to reduce the risk of future pandemics, it is essential to take a One Health approach to protect the health of humans, animals, and the environment. Evidence shows that global wildlife trade is a major contributor to the global decline in biodiversity. The world's natural resources are finite, and the global wildlife trade is unsustainable. Yes, you heard me. Global wildlife trade is unsustainable. It has been described as one of the main challenges to wildlife conservation. We need to transform the industries that drive consumer demand for wildlife, including entertainment, exotic pets, and traditional medicine. With an estimated population of 7.8 billion, people are increasingly migrating from rural to urban areas in search of livelihood opportunities, creating increased demand for food and shelter. The outcome is increased encroachment into natural habitats, which inevitably increases human-wildlife contact and hence the increased risk of zoonotic disease transmission, ecosystem disruption, and biodiversity loss. The outcome is a distressed world with the disruption of the well-being of society, especially the vulnerable communities. In conclusion, in a general sense, what we are saying is that we require a two-pronged approach to address the well-being issues. The first is to tackle the root causes of the global crisis we are currently experiencing, because we are very clear that there is a connection between wildlife trade and the whole issue of the global pandemic that we are suffering now. Second is to reduce the source of vulnerability of those communities that are most impacted. With regard to the first prong, it is essential that we acknowledge that the abuse and exploitation of animals is either a direct cause of the issue affecting well-being or a major factor that accelerates and heightens its impact. If we look at the three dominant crises the world is experiencing today, one, the COVID-19 pandemic, two, the accelerating biodiversity loss and ecosystem degradation, and third, climate change, we find that human behavior which affects animal welfare, such as health, is a key contributing factor. And that's why we are saying from these perspectives, we should conclude that we must improve the well-being of animals and the environment in order to reduce or remove the factors that lead to a lack of human well-being. Thank you. That's our introductory definition to well-being.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mr. Williams. I mean, I was really struck by the statistic about the high percentage of diseases that actually come from wildlife and the stress that we're putting on wildlife, which actually affects human health. So my question for you is, how are current policies and frameworks across sectors and countries threatening well-being of both the environment and human health? Thank you.
Thank you again, Sarah. I mean, the current policies that fail to adequately protect the environment, especially those that tolerate or contribute to or neglect the prevention of biodiversity destruction, threaten the well-being of vulnerable communities. With high poverty levels in Africa, Sarah, and its heavy reliance on agriculture and tourism, such policies and frameworks have grave impacts on the continent. Policies and frameworks that neglect the protection of animal welfare disrupt the well-being of vulnerable communities, given that poor animal welfare practices are known to contribute to public health hazards such as the spread of zoonotic diseases and antimicrobial resistance. Health hazards uniquely affect the poor since they lack the resources to address the resultant conditions. Poor animal welfare also compromises productivity, especially where the introduced breeds are unsustainable for the prevalent ecosystem, and therefore the animals suffer, while the owners also lose both economically and materially. The things we need to urgently capture in policies and frameworks, therefore, across sectors, include the fact that animals are sentient beings. Because this is the basis of their health productivity, and this directly have an impact on human well-being. These policies ought to enhance the protection of the environment, which in turn influences the well-being of animals and human beings. It is critical, therefore, to appreciate that such policies will constrain the farming systems and contribute to the disruption of animal, human, and environmental welfare and put an end to wildlife trade. So in essence, what we are saying is that every policy consideration at the very least must take into account the fact that animals are sentient beings, and the way we treat them will have implications for our own survival as human beings, because animal welfare and human welfare are inextricably linked, and therefore every effort must be made at the policy level to capture the issues concerning the welfare of animals, because as long as human beings continue to interfere with the environment and at the same time interfere with the well-being of animals, our well-being as humans is bound to be affected.
Thank you very much. And as I know that Ambassador Bacose has to leave us soon, I'll actually turn the floor back over to Ambassador Michelle Bacose to give her closing remarks and message to civil society. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry for disrupting this this good program. Well, thank you very, very much indeed for the invitation and for the opportunity to talk. What I would like to say really is that we believe that civil society organizations have a fundamental role to play in advocacy, of course, but also in supporting national responses to COVID-19. And they should be given the platform to speak on behalf of the many voiceless communities. We have urged countries to establish inclusive and transparent COVID-19 governance structures with decision-making bodies that include representatives of community-led organizations. We strongly believe that due to the immense practical, experience, organizational strength, and access to the communities, civil society groups are really well positioned to identify and to mitigate the challenges posed by COVID-19. And particularly, as Rupa was saying, how do we include women? How do we make sure that we answer their needs, their concern, that we can help and support them, as well as children, vulnerable populations, and the very fragile environments. So in addition to being on national COVID-19 task force, and we know that there are not many, they should really be deployed to facilitate the provisions of COVID-19 related information, provide preventive measure and tools, as well as testing and referral for cases. I would like also to mention the role that a civil society can play in helping to speak up to the necessity of ensuring equitable access to vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostic, and global support, and support global solidarity beyond national response to the pandemic. When civil society groups with many different priorities come together and align in joint advocacy efforts, you can strongly incentivize G20 leaders and countries to co-invest in a COVID-19 response so that we can all get back to the broader range of work that needs to be done to achieve the SDGs. In closing, let me really reiterate that WHO is committed to expanding the role of civil society organizations in the COVID-19 response, and we try to work with all stakeholders to build a genuine community ownership of the response. We work across the world to try and bring people together, and your support there is absolutely essential. Thank you very much for your attention. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you so much for the messages you carry.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Bacose, and it was such a privilege and honor to have you with us. And thank you for those excellent points about how civil society can respond to and be integrated into the global COVID-19 pandemic response. So with that, I will then turn it over to our other four panelists to present their closing remarks. So this closing remark will be a message to civil society and a call to action from each of the panelists. And so first, I'll start with Ms. Lang Zhu, Assistant Secretary General and Director for the Bureau of Policy and Program Support, UNDP. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we did a lot of research and studies. We have conducted more than 120, socioeconomic impact assessments, in different countries, in 93 countries. And the UN has also helped our governments to prepare over 110, socioeconomic response plans. In all this work, we identified many tipping points. But the first tipping points we identified is in relation to, in fact, the social contract, the issue of social contract, the people's perceptions and expectations of their governments, and how people expect to be involved in policy debate decisions. So this goes back to the point that Dr. Barini of OECD mentioned, that in future we strongly believe that, and also in the face of complexity and uncertainty, the future policies must be constructed by the involvement of people at large. Right? So I think in this process, we definitely consider the civil society organizations play a critical role to ensure that the well-being, the concerns of well-being for the excluded and marginalized groups are included, their voice is heard in policy discussions. So in this process, I think we do have different tools and methodologies to support civil society organizations, and to work with governments, with international organizations, as well to involve private sector, stakeholders, right, in a joint effort, multilateral, collaborative approach, to ensure that the well-being of people and the planet are both, safeguarded for our future generations. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And my next panelist that I'll turn to is Dr. Ramina Barini, the Acting Director of the Center for Wellbeing and Inclusion, Sustainability, and Equal Opportunity at OECD. Dr. Barini.
Thank you, Sarah. I think from my side, 3 strong points for actions. The first is around data. The second is about driving change on the ground. And the third is about joining forces on a campaign. Let me start with the first, data. You know that what we do at UCD is collect a lot of data, crunch a lot of data, and very often, I would say our data providers are national statistical offices and departments that have the best data. But we know that sometimes those data miss something fundamental. And I think that the civil society are also able to actually put in place quite interesting methodologies to uncover, in fact, the reality of well-being for a number of people, and in particular the ones that are the more invisible. We hosted at the OECD a very interesting conference around the hidden dimensions of poverty, and this is an initiative that was sponsored by ADT Carmonde, but done at the global level. And this research really insisted on this idea that if we want to understand what well-being means of the vulnerable, we need to ask the vulnerables. So that is the first thing I'll ask to civil society and suggest it. So the civil society really works with us, with the OECD, and provide some inputs on the data that we're using. The second is the idea of changing on the ground. And again, there is an area where the civil society organizations are the best. In fact, they have the most interesting experiments, the most vibrant initiatives, again, to take actually action. And this is something that is interesting for us in international organizations, because we can work together, we can give that feedback of what works on the ground to policymakers, and the governments have a big role. You know, they very often design, the rules, the enabling environment for the civil society to operate. So let us know what is working on the ground, and we'll be honored to feedback that to the policymakers. Finally, a global campaign, a very concrete suggestion. This is something we are starting, a global campaign on poverty and well-being in this very specific moment in time. And we are interested in having your ideas for that. And so don't hesitate to reach out to the WISE Center. You will find all references in the OECD website. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Barini, for those really concrete recommendations. Next, I'll turn to Dr. Rupa Dutt, co-founder and executive director of Women in Global Health.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And just want to say that in closing, really is a call to action to all of us collectively in civil society, but all actors really in global health. That we have a opportunity. There is a silver lining to COVID-19. It has given us a chance to deeply reflect about how societies are shaped and designed, and by who, by whom, and how. And so there really is an opportunity for this global wake-up call to build back better, and that women who deliver our health and social care, they really deserve a new social contract with decent work conditions, an equal role in decision-making, and truly a compensated way for everything that they're really doing. So if we look at our society after building back better, we really should create a society where there is a new social contract. And what that contract we're calling for in Women in Global Health is a 5-ask COVID 50-50 gender responsive approach to health security. So first, really ensuring there is gender equal leadership and decision making happening in all aspects of health and health security. Second, really ensuring that we turn applause into action and real investments in safe and decent work conditions for health workers and social workers around the world. Third, really ensuring that we no longer subsidize healthcare globally based on the poorest women, but we really truly end unpaid and informal work in the health and social sector. Fourth, really having a strong call to action of data. We've heard our other panelists here talk about how critical data is to understanding the context, but we're calling for having a closing the gender data gap and having an intersectional approach to data, especially during health security, but more broadly in health systems. And the fifth is really acknowledging that civil society has a critical role, but especially women's movements, grassroots movements at the community level are providing social protections. They are helping us achieve the health and well-being agenda, especially when societies are most challenged. So it's critical that we fund and have resources really go to those community-led organizations, women-fueled movements, and grassroots organizations. So on that note, I'd like to say, our call to action is very much around creating gender equitable societies for greater health and well-being. And let's have a new social contract move forward that is creates better, more equitable societies for all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Dot. And just really appreciate the points from Dr. Barini and Dr. Dot on, not only considering the most vulnerable in our society, but really asking what they need and bringing them to the decision-making table. That's a critical point. Next, I want to hand it over to Mr. Williams to please give your closing remarks and call to action, and then we'll move to the Q&A from the audience. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, in closing, I would say that the COVID-19 pandemic is a watershed moment for all of us, civil society, citizens around the world, and leaders, because it gives us the opportunity to have a completely different perspective in terms of how we treat animals. Animal welfare is critical, and within that, in particular reference to the trade of wildlife, because really it behooves us to appreciate that until and unless we treat animals right, we are going to bear very serious consequences, as COVID-19 has taught us. So this brings to mind our major call for the G20's attention at this year's summit. We are saying that we must ensure, all of us, the call to action, put it to G20 members, that we need to have a ban on global wildlife trade. If we continue this way, certainly the experiences that the world has had is going to be with us for a long time. So let us call our world leaders, let us present the issues to them, let them appreciate that they need to put an end to the trade in wildlife, because it's not good for us, it's not good for the animals either. The disruption of food systems is also something that needs to be considered. So we want to reawaken the call to make sure that world leaders take the right decision at this year's summit by ending global wildlife trade. It is not good for humanity, not good for animals, not good for the environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we'll turn to the Q&A section. So I'll just take a look and see who is asking. And so the question that we've received is from actually a guest who's attending from Beijing. And this guest is asking, in a distressed world, we need each other and we need more unity and cooperation. During COVID-19, our member from Wuhan City received lots of support from around the world. And this person is asking, so how can civil society cooperate better and really work across borders to ensure that countries who really need our support are able to receive that support from all actors across society. So this question is really geared towards cooperation. And I will ask any panelists to please answer this question. Thank you.
Maybe while other colleagues are preparing, what I can say is that in the UN, our country teams, are working very closely with a cross section of stakeholders, in their countries. And under the UN reform, agenda, a new generation of so-called country cooperation frameworks are being formulated in many countries. And I think that this is an opportunity for civil society organizations, to engage in the UN team in their countries, and to make sure that the kind of UN cooperation framework with the government, right, reflects the voices and aspirations of people. I think it is really a good way for the collaboration to take place, across different stakeholders.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And my next question is from Mexico City. In Mexico, there's a critical moment, and the government has disappeared the welfare trust, and the president has concentrated that power. These actions distance the official power and the real solution actors. who this person perceives as civil society. They're the real actors who are implementing solutions. This is an additional condition to development tasks. So how can we implement better policies through working alliances and not isolated work?
Great. So Sarah, I can dive into that, particularly, we know that especially during health emergencies or global emergencies, there is a tendency to clamp down, especially on civil society engagement. And this is happening universally in many places. And, the first reason that we were given is that, it's an emergency. So we really need to just, be very responsive, very reactive, and really did not have any, bandwidth to take on inclusive approach to decision making. But over and over, after every emergency, when we sit down and reflect what worked, what didn't work, what we should be doing better, on top of that agenda is always this strong message that you must engage the communities that are most affected by a particular emergency, by a particular health emergency, and they really should be part of designing the solutions, be part of the response. And so, really clearly, all of us panelists have talked about how important it is to have civil society engagement and community engagement. And so really the call to action is for governments that have already made promises. So these are not new things that we're asking for. These are commitments that governments have made in the Sustainable Development Goals to really increase civil society engagement, participation. So let's really design government structures that can adapt and be flexible when there is a health emergency happening to really already have those community relationships. And I would say go a step further and make sure that those community relationships are gender balanced and truly diverse relationships, so they are also reflective of the diversity that exists in society.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Rupa. And my next question is, how can how can we all drive this conversation towards commitments and reform? But then who should be leading, driving that conversation towards commitments and reform? Should it be the government? Should it be civil society? Should it be multilaterals? Who should be in that driver's seat, towards really achieving the SDGs? And I'll pose that question to any panelist.
Sarah, let me answer to that. I think this is a very important question. I wouldn't think that there is just one actor or one set of actors. This is really, for all strands of society to work together. And I think that's also the beauty of the SDGs, that, we know that in the goal number 17, it's really about joining forces. But clearly, we still need to sort of, I think, sometimes improve the interfaces between these different sectors. One of the things that many speakers talk about, in this session was the notion of social contract. And that makes me think about, how do we, build bridges? So how do we actually create interfaces? And I think the social contract gives us some ideas on how to do that. What we're doing at the OECD right now is we're looking at people's perceptions around inequalities. And this is quite important because it's actually by looking at those perceptions and those beliefs that we get a sense of how priorities of citizens get formed, what are their views and around, for instance, redistributive policies and other type of inclusive growth policies. So that what we need is, to have tools. So I think it's about, leadership, having strong actors that work together. But I think we also need new tools. And so things such as data that tells us what citizens think, what they want, and again, how policies can respond to that, how they can meet people's demand on a number of sort of areas that matter for people's well-being. This is really what we need. So yes, it's, leadership, stewardship, and having obviously strong commitments at all levels. But I think there is also a question about, what are the approaches, what are the data that we use? So I think it has to be both things. It has to be sort of political commitments, but it also has to be about, designing good policies with good data.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Barini. That was really great, and really some really concrete answers to who should lead and what really needs to happen next for implementation. So my question to all of the panelists is, what happens next? So what would you like to see those who are attending today's session take from this session, and what do you exactly want them to do? So what exactly happens next?
So I will have a go at this question, but please allow me to make a quick comment on the question that Dr. Barini responded to earlier on. I totally agree with her. I think it's not really about who drives the process, but I think it's the complementarity that we must ensure happens when it comes to issues like this. Because obviously, government is the owner of and creator, manager of policy space at national level, but there are citizens within those contexts that are very important, and they have a role to play. And multilateral agencies have the responsibility to facilitate the process between local communities and their leaders. So it's really about complementarity in that respect. But the truth of the matter is we must appreciate that the world is changing, things are moving very fast, and there is a lot of pressure, and well-being is being challenged. And who is affected? We cannot advocate for good well-being on behalf of citizens without citizens themselves determining what that well-being is for them. I think it's long ago that these things were happening, and I think we cannot allow them to happen anymore. And I want to remind us that from an animal welfare perspective, again, the context in which we live, we cannot afford to ignore the reality. We never thought that a pandemic such as COVID-19 would befall the human population, but it's here with us, and we got to change our attitude. And I'm thinking it's the same thing that needs to be applied, whether it's women's health, whether it's health for men, etc., etc. So our world leaders must take this into account. At least the G20 this year must hear very clearly what civil society is saying, so that we have a better world.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Williams. And now my next question is, so what should better well-being for the planet and its inhabitants look like? If you could paint a picture for our guests about what does that world look like? You know, we've talked a little bit about problems, we've talked a little bit about solutions, but how exactly do we envision the world to look once these are implemented? Any speaker might take that question. Thank you.
Yes, Sarah, I wanted to chime in on the last one too a bit as well about where do we go from here, and I think that is a question where, you know, everyone that's really tuning in, we really have an opportunity and ability to influence the agenda. So as C20 and the community of C20 really engaging with you know, the G20 is a core part of the mandate, and we really have an opportunity to take all the key messages that have been coming out of today's really rich discussion of, you know, really having an inclusive agenda, an equitable agenda, having one where, you know, gender equality is a core part of it, but we also, you know, talked about the other sectors that are so critical, and especially, you know, the environment and planet and, you know, the animal health. I think these were all such valuable messages. But, you know, what my call would be, let's really see that, you know, particularly the issue of having gender equality is one which is a cross-cutting issue. It's not a special interest. And if we can all integrate that into our area of work, of course, you know, we call on the health community especially, but all of you that are tuning in from different sectors, if you can leverage your influence to advance this agenda so that we really have gender equal decision-making, that we have safe and decent work conditions for all workers that are especially responding in the COVID-19 time period, the invisible workers who aren't counted, really look at how we compensate and really have social and financial protections. And, you know, there's a huge call for data. All of us can do our part to help close the data gap, and really around investments, all of this work that civil society does and civil society, you know, related partners. It's important that we do get, you know, appropriate resources and investments to be able to do this work effectively. As echoed, we are the community that's needed to reach the hardest to reach, the marginalized population. So really a call to action on making sure that our words are backed by real investment and real action. And there is an opportunity to bring this conversation forward in G20, but also to bring it forward wherever these conversations are happening. And at the national level, it is really critical that we show global solidarity, but put this actions into realities and local settings at the national and subnational level. So back to you, Sarah.
Yeah, if I
Thank
may.
you. Thank you so much, Dr.
Yeah.
Scott. Yeah.
Yeah.
Please
So
go
Sarah,
ahead.
Okay, I think the challenge clearly is to deal with both the short-term needs and the long-term needs at the same time. That's going to be a big challenge. But in the short term, in terms of well-being, we really need to make sure that the people, their health, their development achievements are safeguarded. So here, you need to really focus now in the short term on social protection measures, right? So in this regard, it does take a partnership between the government, the private sector, the banking sector, for example, and the civil society groups to make it happen. We know that a lot of people are not in the government system. They're in the informal sectors. So they're not counted in the government social protection system. So how can we use the digital solutions to include more people, giving them digital identity so that they can be covered and supported through social protection system? For example, this is an important measure. But in the long term, to address the issue of carbon subsidy, right? But there's a lot of subsidy that is not being used productively, targeting the needy, but also causing tremendous damage to the environment. So how do we, as we consider building back better, addressing the question of carbon subsidy, addressing the issue of energy transition, right? And globally, how do we look at that architecture, right? That is unfair to a lot of developing countries and so forth. So I think that's the challenge. We need on all these issues, we need a partnership working together with civil society groups, representing people's voices. Over.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zhu. And I'd also like to hand it over to Dr. Barini, who wanted to address the previous question. So Dr. Barini, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, I think actually we already have the vision. That's the SDGs. This SDGs is our common blueprint for the future. So we just have to stick with that and work to achieve that. But to me, that actually boils down to three simple points. The first is about equality. So we do need to have equal societies in place, and that means, of course, gender equality. But it also means, looking at the different conditions of different children and households and minorities, different ethnicities, races, etc. We haven't covered that, and that's so important. So equal society is the first step into that. The second is about having economies and societies that thrive on purpose and on meaning. So we really have to change the way we behave, human beings, but also all the economy is functioning right now. The economy is there, not to make profits. For some, it's there to serve the human's well-being. So and make sure again that we can all try with meaning. And the final is about the planet. And the previous speaker was just telling about, of course, the great challenge that the planet is facing now. So we do need to really, achieve a lower footprint for this planet. And that transition that all countries of this planet need to start and really sort of to accelerate on needs to be fair. We can't just transit, to new energy systems, to new production systems if we don't bring all on board. And if we don't take into account, again, the needs of the most disadvantaged people. So a fair transition is what we need.
Thank you, Dr. Barini. Well, that's the end of our Q&A session. I'd like to thank all of you for such an engaging session and for each of your perspectives. I personally really enjoyed hearing you and learned quite a lot, and I'm sure our guests did as well. I'd just like to end with this. We are currently in a global pandemic. However, we not only have a huge burden in front of us, but also a huge opportunity. So we can either take 10 steps forward or 10 steps back. We really need to utilize this critical window of opportunity to take real action on the SDGs. And we need to heed COVID-19 as a wake-up call to be able to work together, work across borders, work across sectors to make real change as we approach the end of our SDG agenda over the next years. And so I really thank all of you. I really thank all of our guests, our organizers for this session, and look forward to seeing lots of the great work that many of you are doing, and many of the great initiatives that are ongoing. And with that, I just want to end the session and say a huge thank you to everyone. And I hope everybody has a wonderful afternoon, evening, morning, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much.